Have you ever heard of frames per second, or in short, FPS? Well, in today's video, we're going to take a quick look into it. Almost all cameras today, and even the phone that you are currently using, most probably has the option to shoot in different frames per second. You may have come across this before, but because you didn't quite understand it and it didn't really affect the video that you were shooting, so you decided to leave it in its default option. Now, although it is true that you can still record in whatever frames per second you are currently using, knowing how and why we shoot in different frames per second can be a really helpful skill in your creativity. I'm an iPhone user, so what I say may appear slightly different in the device that you are using, but I don't think it would affect your ability to follow along. First thing you want to do is go to your settings app and scroll down until you find your camera setting. Once you've clicked on it, you'll see that there is an option under record video. Now, if you click in that folder, you'd find many options to shoot in different resolutions as well as frames per second, or also written there as FPS. We're just going to focus on 1080 and 4K because most people don't even use 720 nowadays. Now, if you see that there is 1080 HD, but there is in 30 frames and 60 frames. And you've got the option of shooting 4K at 24 frames, 30 frames, or even 60 frames per second. So what exactly are these different options? It's important to note that a video is pictures taken at a rapid rate and stitched together in order to display a moving image. So when we talk about 24, 30, 60 frames, or even 120 frames per second, that is the amount of pictures or frames that is taken in a second of the video that you're watching. If this is your first time hearing this, I bet you appreciate your camera or your phone even more right now. Now, the film industry has been making most of their movies in 24 frames per second, giving it what we often call now the film look. Because of that, our brains have been generally trained to watch videos in 24 frames per second. So much so that an average person can notice the difference in a video shot in higher frames per second, even though they don't really understand why it looks different. 24 frames per second is also the lowest amount of frames we generally want to record in, because if we go any lower than that, you might start to notice a jitter in the video that you're making. So knowing this, why should we shoot in anything else apart from 24 frames per second? Good question. Well, one reason is slow motion. Because 24 frames per second is the lowest amount of frames we want to shoot in, if we use a 24 FPS footage and slow it down, there isn't enough frames to compensate for the time. So the slow motion ends up looking more like the video is lagging. Now, if that's the look that you're going for, then by all means, go ahead and do so. Some people like having that old TV or old camera effect. But if you shoot in 60 frames per second, you still have a lot of room to lessen the speed of the video without going below the 24 frames per second mark. Which means you could slow down a 60 frames per second video by 60% and you'll still have that smooth motion. So what if we're not planning to slow down our footage later? What happens if we record in 24, 30 or 60 frames per second? When we record in 24 frames per second, you'd notice a significant amount of motion blur in your footage. If you don't know exactly what motion blur is, just lift up your hand in front of your face and shake it really fast. You notice that your hands look a little blurry. Well, that is motion blur. Shooting at a higher frame rate lessens the amount of motion blur in your footage, which makes movement look much clearer, but often too clear in my personal opinion. Have you ever watched a movie and the movement just felt weird to you? Well, that's exactly it. So just a quick tip. If you're shooting a video with somebody talking in it, you'd most likely want to shoot in 24 frames or 30 frames per second. But if you're shooting some B-rolls, cutaways, or lots of movement in a video and maybe later on you'd want to slow down some of them, then I'd highly recommend you to shoot in 60 frames per second. Now remember, as always in filmmaking, these are just some of the rules. But once you know the rule, you can break it in order to get a particular look or style in your videos. Well, if this was helpful to you, subscribe and follow us and tag a friend if you think that this would also be helpful to them. See you in the next video. Have a great day or night.